Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this is a little weird. I don't think there's ever been an episode of this series where I've really liked as many albums in one go. A solid half of this list is legit great. And given that it's felt like 2021 has started off pretty slow, this was a lot of fun to explore. So no wasting time. Let's get on the pulse. We got 10 albums on the docket today. Let's go back and talk about, from Mac Leaphart, Music City.
That train. Don't know how much longer I can wait.
Okay, it's been too long since I've talked about indie country, so here we've got a singer-songwriter whose vocal delivery reminds me of a much more hoarse B.J. Barham, maybe a little bit of Gabe Lee, and a wry pen that's already earned some comparisons to the late John Prine, but with a more traditional honky-tonk palette with plenty of pedal steel and piano instead of rougher Americana. Now, he's been active across the last decade in the underground, but after hearing about the acclaim for his newest album, I first checked out his 2015 project and found a lot to like. So, going into this, yeah, I gotta say, I enjoyed this a lot too. Yeah, it's a palette of stripped-back, honky-tonk country you have heard plenty of times before, but there's a lot of rickety texture in the percussion and acoustics, the bass line is very well balanced, and the fiddle, harmonica, and pedal steel, they keen at precisely the right frequency to add a lot of melodic foundation and not overwhelm the mix. But what punches above for me is Leaphart is the writing, which has the deft cleverness to paint the scene with a lot of nuggets of wit, like how the former drinker cusses out Leaphart for drinking, but never seems to acknowledge why there might be deeper issues to why he's not happy and blame it on the bottle, or his own self-deprecating exhaustion in trying to make it in Nashville on the title track, which flows really well into a lot of the wistful questions on That Train. But again, a lot of these songs feel heartfelt all the same, like how on The Same Thing, it seems to start off with the same sort of dejected, I saw an X across the way, but then lets a woman's backing voice slip in, and allows the nuance to show how she's moved on and how her new partner sees something different but just as valid in their relationship. Or take Window from the Sky, which is kind of interesting because it expands on the metaphor of a bird stuck inside who can't see the window to get out of the house, but then drills into how a friend of his could be much the same in hard times, or how he himself questions his own instincts until maybe you just gotta hit rock bottom and you just have to plow through. A struggle for which he is not sympathetic, especially when you get a song like Every Day, where from the third person he tells the story of a couple where the woman is working and kind of burning out trying to support her husband's artistic dreams, and it's kind of heartbreaking not to see him actually learn to do more. Hell, it might be in third person to avoid sense of an autobiography, but the anxiety behind the song rings true. Now, I do think Honey Shake plays in for some of the screwball antics in more ways than one, and thus it didn't quite stick for me, mostly because Leaphart can't quite sell it vocally, but I also gotta be honest, the entire album is worth it for a Ballad of Joe Yamaha or a simple Plea in C major, which is a song written from the perspective of an old guitar, and it's just goddamn amazing and a lot of the low-key wit and wordplay. And as such, yeah, solid 8 out of 10, just some great indie country, highly recommended. Check this out. Next up, from For Your Health, In Spite Of. Okay, got some more screamo here, this time from the more ragged, wonky, post-hardcore slash mathcore set, from which I've got a mixed track record. Anyway, this band dropped an EP in 2019, a split with Shingard in that same year, and now with this solo full-length, can I just get away with saying this is not for me whatsoever? I mean, I'm not going to deny that there's technical complexity and the shrieking guitar leads and the drum work, and how often this will slip into brighter post-hardcore sections that often feel like they're screaming for air, not helped by the vocalist's howled vocals and some underwhelming clean singing buried midway in the back. But it's also one of those cases where it's so cacophonous and the cluttered mix means that any attempts at a truly pummeling groove or really striking melody, or indeed any real sense and attempted atmosphere, it's completely sucked away from me. Not helped by bass that has presence but inconsistent punch, some weirdly muddy feeling drums, and no attempt to let a real texture or tune really cut through. I gotta be honest, it just kind of washes over me without a lot of distinctive or memorable impact, which is not a good sign when that's primarily your aggro mode of the project. So I gotta go to the content here, and well, the poetry's got some welcome flair, and I like the anti-capitalist, very online streak that slips into a couple of songs that puts you in the mind of a very specific, quasi-demented stripe at mid-2000s LiveJournal and MySpace emo online, but also most of it circles a sort of self-flagellating emo material that you find yourself wishing hit harder than it does coming out of that era. Again, I get the distinctive impression this will work way better for a very different audience. I like a little bit more tune and refinement in the screamo that works for me, and while I get the appeal of this, just didn't quite click, so strong 5 out of 10, again, not for me. Next up from L Harle, Harlecore.
See your heart's been broken too. So just lay here on a mountain, me and you.
You know, I guess I'm not all that surprised this wound up on my docket. Another tentative stab towards the blurry intersection between the PC music crew and hyperpop. The full-length debut of one of the founding members after a pretty expansive production catalog, including a lot with Carolyn Polachek. His last project was in 2017, so there's gotta be some real anticipation behind this. And am I the only one who feels kind of underwhelmed for all the hype? Maybe it's just the fact that when I first got into electronic music, I listened to a lot of eurodance and trance, but to me this reminds me way too much of the blown-out, squonking techno eurodance fusions you'd normally catch in the 2000s that were trying a little bit too hard for arena bombast and presence without the distinctive crescendos or melodies to really help those moments transcend, not helped by some of the hyperpop tendencies to let the metallic gloss and shuddering texture really overwhelm a lot of the Technicolor melodies. And you know, if you want a lot of aggressive smash cuts, then that brand of high-energy techno, full of chipmunk vocals and whirling energy, with only a couple spare ambient moments to catch your breath, this will satisfy, you'll get that. And you know what, even for me, there is something about those super crisp synths splashing against everything that's hard for me to dislike. It's kind of got that retro appeal for me. But that being said, there are parts of this album where I felt so beholden to its influences that I found myself wishing for a little bit more of that uniquely warped PC music sound. It feels almost weirdly safe, and again, oddly, a bit retro in its ground that it's covering, which doesn't really stand out as much as you would hope here. Now, granted, when you have MC Boing doing a very specific and kind of demented callback to Crazy Frog era dance music, and DJ Mayhem doing his own blown-out, squonking thing, it does feel a bit more contemporary, or at least a little bit more very online. But given how short a lot of these songs feel, I'm left thinking that they could have expanded a few of these pieces, given them a bit more meat, even if that's tempting fate calling back to some of the utterly bloated Eurodance projects of that era, I remember. But for me, it's a solid 6 out of 10. I did want to like this a little more, but it feels like a proper debut with the seeds planted for more here. Also, I don't care what anyone says. Cars song, it slaps. Next up from S.G. Lewis, Time.
You're so familiar, like I've been here before. Don't just look at me with that glare in your eyes. Just let it happen. Feed the fire.
I'm a little bit surprised folks are looking for my opinion on this. S.G. Lewis is one of those somewhat anonymous pop singer-producers that can cultivate an okay, blissed-out vibe and some alright grooves, but the songs I found memorable from him in 2019, they all had guest features. Well, anyway, it's his formal solo debut album, and again, I gotta be honest, while I think it's an expanded and more likable and textured approach to S.G. Lewis's sound, there is a part of me that still thinks that this sounds a little bit more anonymous than I would like, or again, at the very least kind of dependent on its guest features. Yeah, the gentle, bassy burble midway between vintage house and new disco, it's very well balanced and features more organic percussion and texture and to complement some of the keyboard splashes and bits of guitar, but it very quickly slides into the background and it's kind of tough to pin down initially why. Part of it might be the lack of any truly excellent hooks outside of maybe Heartbreak on the Dance Floor with Francis, that seems to be interpolating parts of Erasure's Always on the pre-chorus, which you all might recognize more likely from Robot Unicorn Attack, but I also think more of it has to do with the guest star personalities that are just shining through to the point where it seems like S.G. Lewis is giving them remixes of songs that they would have already made in previous years instead of a synthesis of producer or an artist, or them complimenting his sound, and that's not sounding when he completely sounds anonymous as a singer himself. So when we get Rye on the opening song, it sounds like a brighter and bouncier version of a cut that Rye would have had on that last album, or how One More is pulling from exactly the same sort of retro disco and funk that Nile Rodgers has been making for decades. Same with Robin and Channel Tres. Although with Feed the Fire, Lucky Day just sounds like he would do exactly the same sort of thing on a Kaytranada song. And you know what, I'll say that, at least Kaytranada would have a bit more unique character and personality, even if I didn't quite love Bubba as much as I wanted to. But overall, this is likable, it's fun enough, but I also know I'm gonna forget it in record time, and for this brand of electronic music, even if the vibes are there, kind of an issue. So solid 6 out of 10. Wish more of it had stuck with me. Next up from Genesis Owusu, Smiling with No Teeth.
I don't need you. Oh, wait, this is true. I don't like you. I don't like you.
Am I the only one who thinks this came right the hell out of nowhere? Granted, the Kieran J. Callanan cosign does help, and I guess if you're in Australia, this debut might have had more popular groundswell, but when I started seeing a lot of global critical acclaim and attention thrown this way, I was very curious what we could be getting with this, and, well, to be honest, this is the sort of warped blur of genres that's tricky to immediately pin down what we're dealing with. I've seen this classified as both neo-soul and experimental hip-hop, the latter of which has to be from some of those MC Ride-esque tones that he opens up the album with. The Death Grips influence does come through in spots, but I'm not really sure I would call that fitting either, nor would I call him the Australian Andre 3000, whose brand of genre bending was on a much silkier wavelength. If anything, this reminds me a lot more of the slippery, synth-inflected approaches to funk we saw from Childish Gambino on Awaken My Love 5 years ago, although maybe leaning a little heavier on the 80s funk and R&B, especially the Prince influence, with a lot of the sharper choices of grooves and some of the guitar work and the more theatrical edges. And that's also reflected in his occasionally offbeat, wonky delivery in both the rapping and the crooning, his very keen sense of humor balanced out with some pretty sharp social commentary, and how he'll leap across genres with utter aplomb, even dabbling in some synth punk, and pretty convincingly too. That was a nice surprise. Hell, even though this is still very much a debut in that it feels a little bit scattered and still feeling out his style, and as such it does kind of run a little long, there is so much variety and potential on display with so much color that the production balances out so incredibly well. I gotta give him props. And that parallel also extends somewhat to the content, where Genesis Owusu centers two black dog characters within himself, containing the depression and vices for which he's still tempted, even if it's only ever gonna give him hollow victories, and the outward forces of racism that carry as much weight on his psyche, adding in the subtext that as a black man he will be framed at his worst, especially if any of it can be then translated in a capitalist system for cold success. Now, fortunately, pretty early in the process of the album, he shows how he can explore and accept some of those darker impulses, but also control them. But he's also making some very sharp and pointed observations about how, as a minority, Genesis Owusu is held up as a representative, while a lot of white folks are allowed to just be individuals. And then that's balanced out with some moments where he just claps back, and the righteousness has some legit punch. He doesn't mince words. Especially by the end, he's still trudging forward, and there are hints of optimism. Overall, from the layers of the concept to just how textured and flavorful the album is, it was a debut for the ages. Yeah, absolutely terrific. I like this a lot. Solid 8 out of 10. Happy I got to it. Check it out. Next up from Julien Baker, Little Oblivion.
Is there something that I'm trying to avoid?
I feel like I've been adjacent to the rise of Julien Baker for the past 4 or 5 years now. She was on the 2016 Touche Amore album, seemed to really get traction in 2017 with Turn Out the Lights. I just never had the chance to hear her material, and now I really have. Well, you know, I mentioned this briefly when I covered Phoebe Bridgers last year, and I've been talking about this with some friends. I just tend to have way more luck with indie singer-songwriters when they're coming more from country rather than acoustic folk, often thanks to a greater sense of lyrical detail and not defaulting to a very specific husky timbre that's kind of played out. I'm not saying that her first 2 albums are bad. Her first album had some really evocative and subtly raw moments. Her second album expanded the sound considerably, and I found most of her writing surrounding mental health struggles very solid and well framed, if not always as potent as I would wish they would be. But like with Phoebe Bridgers, I wasn't really over the moon originally, outside of spots. And now with this album, again, honestly, I'm a little bit more torn on this than I want to be. Little Oblivions continues the arc from Turn Out the Lights sonically, in that the album feels more percussive and expansive, and closer to a style and tone in indie folk rock that had a run in the early 2010s, for which I have mixed opinions. But I think my larger question is whether or not this complements Baker's delivery and content. And in the former case, I'm not really sure it does. Her raspier delivery doesn't quite have the power or foundation to match the scale of this production palette, and thus to compensate, they either nestle her belting further back in the mix, which doesn't happen nearly enough, I really wish she would belt more, or it just feels like the fluttery post-rock adjacent guitars, the weirdly filmy cymbals, and the blocky percussion, the ugly gauze of any sort of synth integration, and any sense of pulsating groove is just washed out and stuck behind buttery layers of reverb. And suddenly it feels like a bunch of old indie rock frustrations from the past decade are right back here again. Look, I'm not denying it can produce the appearance of having some heft, but it feels weirdly flat to me without more dynamics, lacking the coursing swell and texture it's really trying to deliver. And considering that once again the biggest strength here is Baker's writing, I'm not sure this approach flatters any sense of intimacy, which has often been her greatest strength, or amplifies the raw emotional gut punch in a lot of the content. I might think that Ringside feels painfully clunky in both its percussion line and its mixing, but at least the guitar had a bit more of a jangling edge, and I like that. So okay, this is where your album has to be saved by the writing, and you know, I don't deny there's a certain rawness in hitting the painful points of depression, substance abuse, or just outright abuse, self or otherwise, in many of these songs. And there are a lot of potent moments in the writing, especially in how she emphasizes the performative elements of modern Christianity that can nevertheless serve as a balm for those who crave it. And there might even be a hint of jealousy from her on that. But on some level, this also kind of reminds me of that Smith Street Band album from last year, where the relentlessly downbeat atmosphere seems like she's more set on replaying her trauma on repeat. It might be well constructed, but the lack of greater variance just makes it feel kind of flat overall. I'm less likely to go back to it. I mean, the light will draw attention to the darkness, and given the arrangements and delivery don't really amplify that light, the album just kind of winds up feeling middle of the road for me. Ergo Light 6 out of 10. I absolutely get why this is getting so much critical acclaim from some audiences, but even beyond indie country writers, I've heard these tones and this subject matter explored with more power and detail. Just okay as a result. Gotta say it. Next up, from Cloud Nothings, The Shadow I Remember.
Does anybody living out there really need me?
So I kind of expected there to be a little bit more hype around this than I've seen. Cloud Nothings are getting back with Steve Albini on production, which led to one of the best indie rock albums of the 2010s, An Attack on Memory. Maybe this would be the sharp, explosive moment that the band has circled but never quite achieved since. But here's the thing, the average listener, even in indie rock, they're not going to pick up on the differences in production the same way I will. For a lot of folks, this is just going to be another Cloud Nothings album. All nervy bass lines, tight riffs, and the increasingly brighter guitar tone, only more evident with every single layer you're stripping away. So no, it's not on the tier of Attack on Memory, but it at least is close to that tier, with 2018's often slept on Last Building Burning, plus with Steve Albini providing a lot of that ragged, nervy engineering and commitment to production dynamics that made Attack on Memory so damn great. Even if growth over the years means it can't quite recapture 2012's magic, ever again. I think I just gotta have to give up on that. But I also think part of it is that Dale and Baldy's limitations as a singer, they've just become more glaringly obvious with every single passing album, where he might have some snide energy, but is rarely ever placed to make his sharper hooks really cut through. And the few moments of limp multi-tracking or the female vocals added to Nothing Without You, they just do not have enough to back him up, especially when the actual instrumentation and compositions are so strong otherwise. And the funny thing is, to my surprise, I actually think the content shows a progression as well, from a lot of the rampant nihilism of the previous two albums in asking the open question if you can really move beyond all that, change from the darkness of your past, or how the hell you're even going to be able to do it, or whether or not you're just the same person at a different time, especially when you might now be in a relationship and their movements might actually start to reflect yours, especially as love has a funny way of pushing some things along. Hell, this album might have a few of the closest things to love songs that Cloud Nothings has ever written, even if a track like Only Light would have them wanting to rip apart space and time to create that vibe for the two of them, or how he breaks apart the pseudo-religious desperation on Open Rain. But you know what, that sense of space and just being around those people you love, it does feel increasingly relevant, especially given the previous year. So you know what, I don't know. If denial was the underlying subtext of their 2020 album, this is more about acceptance, and it's about the closest thing to earnestness that this band has found in a long time, and yeah, I dug it a lot. Light 8 out of 10. Even if you think you know what you're getting, you'll probably dig it. Nice surprise, check it out. Next up from Jetty Bones, Pushback. This is the sort of artist for whom I built this series, who has just so much talent, is such a defiantly unique but accessible approach to indie pop that I gotta give him more exposure in aggregate. And there was a part of me that thought that Jetty Bones could net a solo review for this full-length project, which expands and varies her sound even further, bringing in contemporary splashes of trap, pop, and new disco, and even a country folk cut called Dolly that sounds like it could fit among the best of Mumford & Sons. But you know, at the core, Jetty Bones' approach is exactly what I found so captivating when I discovered her accidentally on Bandcamp in 2019 with the Hyphen EP that produced one of my favorite songs of that year. It's a chipper, theatrical pop presence and an approach that's almost overflowing with energy, all backing up some really goddamn dark content with an emo approach to songwriting and detail, and the juxtaposition is stark as all hell. I gotta be honest, I was a little bit concerned how she would actually evolve or expand on it, and turns out she did so in the most obvious but also most effective way by expanding beyond the recovery narrative of her last project and giving a little bit more dimension to herself and her stories. And I will say this, the arc of the album's kind of fascinating, because at first the song's talking about anxious, overthought relationships or breakups. They've got a brand of wordiness where it almost becomes kind of tough to follow what's actually happening. The emotionality is so tangled, but then you realize that might be part of the point. It's a pushback. Maybe it's deflection from the audience, but it's more likely it's just from herself, as the next chunk of the album is surprisingly way more direct in exposing the alcohol abuse, the loneliness, the imposter syndrome, and the rampant depression and anxiety that doesn't just shape her life, but also a lot of the storytelling on the album itself. It almost embraces metatext outright. On Waking Up Exhausted, you can tell it's as much of a break of the fourth wall as a drained confession that something is very deeply wrong, to the point where the album's final songs are outright suicidal, with Bug Life containing voicemail snippets from friends and family, and even herself stepping in to tug herself back from the brink. She wrote that song intended as a suicide note, and she still faces that daily struggle, but there's enough here to keep going forward. There is enough who care. Now, all that being said, if you feel some tonal whiplash or the feeling that the album is trying to cram a little bit too much into its half-hour runtime, and the experiments can feel a little thin, I get it. I love the saxophone integration on a couple songs, but on Bad Trick it just feels like there are a few missing lead vocal passages on the hook, which feel purposefully removed, and I just do not think it works. Experiment just didn't pull it off. But as a whole, no, there's not a song here that's on the tier of better, but there's definitely a few close to the rest of them, which was one of my favorite songs of 2019, and thus, yeah, you know what, Jetty Bones, she pushed herself back from the brink and delivered a really great album. Light 8 out of 10, highly recommended. Next up from Epica, Omega. I can't tell you how high my expectations were for this album. And believe it or not, it's not just because I think by happenstance Epica is wound up as one of the most consistent symphonic metal acts who can be counted on for a high level of quality, but it's also because so many of their peers from around the same era have really disappointed me in recent years. Plus, it's been 5 years since the Epica's last full-length album, and I could use some metal with a lot of bombast and flavor, and oh wow, this might be among their best work. Now, when I say that, I do have to qualify it a little bit. The best of Epica is great, but not classic, which is where I put albums like The Divine Conspiracy, Design Your Universe, and The Quantum Enigma, and I will say there's enough niggling issues with Omega that lets me put it alongside them, maybe not above them. It's a bit overwritten, the album runs a little long, you can argue it doesn't quite have enough melodic variation from track to track, and that means that certain moments don't pop out as strongly as they could, and while there's a lot less of these issues, I at least notice the triggers in the drum kit that don't quite give the kick drums the punch they could have. I'm always going to point it out, even if they don't sound as programmed as some other bands in the subgenre. But let's be blunt, these are all trademark Epica issues more than anything. And where this album shines are the moments where they transcend them. Simone Simons is getting the benefit of the most vibrant and well-balanced production in modern symphonic metal, but she's also grown leaps and bounds as an expressive performer since the 2000s, and her versatility in both an operatic and more modern theatrical register, they make her a perfect contrast to all the sharper growls and screams. More to the point, Epica is expanding their sound as well. Man, I couldn't be happier. The orchestra is more robust. There are passages that pull from Middle Eastern and Indian music that feel a lot less voyeuristic when Nightwish tried it on Dark Passion Play, most because they actually collaborated with Zahir Zorgati, frontman of the Tunisian prog metal band Myrath. And then, when we actually do get more synthesizers, not as many as I was expecting, I'm almost stuck wondering why they didn't use more of them. Finally, a symphonic metal band with decent taste and analog synth tones that can balance out the punishing riffs and balance out some real melody. But okay, what about the content? Epica's got a reputation as one of the smarter symphonic metal bands, for what that's worth, and in this case they're exploring finality and the theme of endings, blurring together Gnostic Apocrypha with more of a broad, pseudo-spiritual edge than I was expecting, with the expected questions of sanity-breaking concepts that Epica has been drilling into for the past 2 albums, especially coming with that leap of faith that comes with exploring that particular brand of enlightenment. Because after all, if you want to find that sort of transcendence, presumably a certain worldly experience has to end, leaning into the theory of the Omega Point and its convergence of reason and spirituality that you can tell such a rationalist band like Epica has been very tentative to explore. But again, given how much humanity's been messing with the natural order and the environment, that convergence could be coming faster than even they expected, so they gotta get particularly comfortable with it in some form. At the very least, there needs to be some sort of balance that has to be restored, and it's very interesting how Epica's view is more forward-thinking and global in approaching it, while still maintaining some of that optimistic spirit that was genuinely invigorating on the holographic principle, even if, like whenever this band goes a little high concept, it can get kind of clunky in some of the lyrics. But still, this might be one of the best symphonic metal albums I have heard in years. Epica really knocked this out of the park, strong 8 out of 10, and if there's a statement they made to the field, yeah, it's this. You gotta hear it. And finally, from Zara Larsson, Poster Girl.
I'm just in a t-shirt on the couch. The way you want me makes me want you now. The only thing you have to say is
Did any of you even know this came out? Dead serious, I don't know what the hell happened to Zara Larsson's momentum coming out of the mid-2010s, but I heard very little hype for this release, and I wasn't sure why. I mean, I would normally point to singles underperforming, but she was never a hitmaker stateside, and Ruin My Life did move units in 2018. Now that did concern me a bit, but then I saw a list of co-writers and producers, including Julia Michaels, Mattman and Robin, Marshmello, and The Monsters and Strangers. Basically for me, a giant warning sign of what sort of C-list pop production and writing we were really gonna get. And Julia Michaels was the one who really concerned me, because Zara Larsson is devil-may-care and strident, almost kind of capricious in a lot of her style and presentation, and none of those phrases have remotely ever described anything Julia Michaels has written. And so, Okay, look, the issue with So Good was refinement. Zara Larsson has star power. Her 2014 debut One proved with focus and refinement she had the pipes and real charisma to back her up, but she's never had a chance to drill in, refine her own approach. And when the hooks aren't there, we wound up with a stretch of middling tracks that really could have been given to anyone, and Julia Michaels' writing doesn't remotely fit with that personality she's established. Because there's not a hook here that's better than Lush Life or Never Forget You. The vocal mixing and mastering has somehow gotten worse. Zara Larsson has a bigger voice. It's the Tove Lo problem all over again of sloppy pickups. And you can also tell that Young Thug really only took his verse for a very quick paycheck, and probably not a big one. And I challenge anyone to pick out a distinctive or consistent instrumental sound that actually flatters or amplifies her. I mean, if I was stretching, I would say some of the metallic synths, the blocky drums, and the pitch shifting might be the clumsiest possible pull towards hyperpop, or maybe some of the fat bass grooves imply something of a retro disco flourish, like the title track that's both trying and not trying to be a weed anthem. But in both cases, it's a stretch. The closest comparison is probably the desaturated trap-adjacent pop of the late 2010s that struggled for any sense of color and identity, with this probably being the last gasps of it. Well, maybe that was the reason that Epic was struggling to ship this, that in 2021 it already sounds dated and derivative, and given the writing can't even flatter Zara Larsson's established personality or delivery, only inhibited by bad production, we're stuck with her worst album. And then again, a very obvious reason why you hadn't heard about it yet. 4 out of 10, no recommendation. Yeah, disappointing. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I understand this might have been a bit of a long one, kind of ended on a downer note, which I didn't want to do. There's a lot of great albums, but beyond that, if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process so I can get more albums out that you want me to cover, or perhaps join my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Please do not feel obligated to do so. Again, it's tough times out there, but if you want to have that opportunity, there it is. It's available. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. I'm sure you guys have plenty of comments on half the dozen things I've said, so have fun down there below. And until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.